Immanuel Kant in the context of his thought. Immanuel Kant (1724–1804) was born in the city of Königsberg in East Prussia, now Kaliningrad, Russia, and dedicated his life to pursuit of knowledge in the academic environment. The 18th century, the period in which Kant lived and developed his philosophy, was marked by the intellectual movement of the Enlightenment, which emphasized the centrality of reason and the advancement of scientific knowledge as means for the understanding and progress of humanity. In the context, Kant was initially influenced by the rationalist philosophy of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, systematized by Christian Wolff, which predominated in German universities of the time. In parallel, the introduction to Isaac Newton's physics, thought his tutor Martin Knudsen, awakened in Kant a lasting interest in science and its ability to explain the natural world based on rational principles. A crucial moment in Kant's intellectual trajectory was in contact with the work of the empiricist philosopher David Hume, whose radical skepticism regarding causality and the possibility of metaphysical knowledge awakened him, as he himself stated from his dogmatic slumber. Kant formation was therefore characterized by tension between continental relationism, with its emphasis on innate ideas and logical deduction, and Brist's empiricism, which derived all knowledge from sensory experience. Newton's physics represented a paradigm of empirical success rooted in mathematical and rational principles, contrasting with the impasses of rationalist metaphysics. Hume's reading, by questioning the very basis of the metaphysical knowledge through his skepticism about causality, represented a fundamental challenge to traditional philosophical conceptions. Kant perceived the need for a new approach that could reconcile these seemingly irreconcilable points of view, seeking a more secure foundation for scientific knowledge and morality. The foundation of Kanto-critical philosophy. At the heart on Kant-critical philosophy lies Transcendental Idealism, a doctrine that establishes a fundamental distinction between phenomenon and noumenon. The phenomenon represents the world as it appears to us, shaped by our cognitive faculties, while the noumenon, or the thing in itself, is the reality that exists independently of our perception, remaining forever unknowable. Kant argues that space and time are entities or properties of the world in itself, but rather pure forms of sensible intuition, in-rehearsed to our way of perceiving objects. These forms of intuition are subjective, in the sense that they are also universal and necessary for any possible experience. According to Transcendental Idealism, the objects for our experience are not simply given to the mind passively, but are actively constructed by it from sensory impressions and universal concepts called categories, which Kant derives from the logical forms of judgments, are a priori concepts that structure the way we think about objects, making experience intelligible. There are 12 categories divided into 4 classes: quantity, unity, plurality, totality, quality, reality, negation, limitation, relation, inherence and subsistence, causality and dependence, community and modality, possibility, existence, necessity. The function of these categories is to synthesize the manifold of intuition, unifying the diverse sensory impressions under concepts to form objective knowledge. It is important to distinguish between the logical use of categories as predicates of objects and their transcendental use as conditions of possibility of experience. To understand Kantian epistemology, the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgment, as well as between a priori and a posteriori knowledge, is fundamental. An analytic judgment is one in which the concept of the subject, being true by definition. A synthetic judgment, on the other hand, is one in which the predicate adds something new to the concept of the subject, expanding our knowledge. A priori knowledge is that which is independent of experience, being universal and necessary. A posteriori knowledge is derived from sensory experience and therefore is particular and contingent. The central problem that Kant faces in the Critique of Pure Reason is how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? That is both new and necessary independent experience. The Copernican revolution in theoretical philosophy. Problem of how synthetic a priori knowledge is possible. Kant proposes an inversion in the traditional relationship between the subject and the object of knowledge, a change of perspective that himself compares to the astronomical revolutions of Nicholas Copernicus. Just as Copernicus explained the movement of celestial bodies by postulating that the Earth revolves around the Sun, instead of the other way around, Kant suggests that we should consider that it is not the mind that conforms to objects to know them, but rather the objects that conform to the structure of our mind. In this Copernican revolution, the human mind is seen not as a mere passive receiver of sensory impressions, but as an active agent in the constitution of experience itself. Our perception of reality is shaped by the forms of intuition, space and time, and by categories of the understanding, which are a priori cognitive structures that organize and give meaning to sensory data. Instead of assuming that our knowledge must adapt to a pre-existing world independent of our mind, Kant proposes that the world we experience is structured by the very cognitive capacities of the subject. This inversion in the relationship between subject and object has profound implications for metaphysics and for the possibility of synthetic a priori knowledge. By postulating that the objects of experience must conform to our way of knowing them, Kant offers an explanation for how synthetic a priori judgment are possible. The laws of mathematics and the fundamental principles of physics, for example, are universally and necessarily valid because they are based on RHE forms of our intuition and the categories OD our understanding. However, this same cognitive structure that makes scientific knowledge possible also establishes limits for human knowledge, restricting it to the world of phenomena and making traditional metaphysical knowledge about the noumenon, the reality in itself that remains beyond the reach of our possibly experience, impossible. Kantian ethics and its impact thought. The ethics of Immanuel Kant, mains exposed in the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, and critique of practical reason, represents one of the most influential moral theories in Western philosophy. Kant grounded morality in reason, arguing that it is our rational capacity that allows us to recognize moral duty and act according to universal principles. For Kant, morality should not depend on feelings, inclination, or actions, but rather on the intention behind them and the fulfillment of duty. Central to Kant ethics is the concept of goodwill, which Kant considers the only unconditional good. A goodwill is not good because of the results it produces, but because it wills the good in itself, that is, by acting out of duty in respect for the moral law. Kant distinguishes between hypothetical imperatives, which are conditional commands that tell us what to do to achieve a certain end, and the categorical imperative, which is an unconditional command that orders us to act in a certain way regardless of our desires or objectives. The categorical imperative is the fundamental moral law of Kantian ethics, and Kant presents several formulations of this imperative. One of the best Kant formulation ID the formula of universal law, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. This formulation asks us to test the morality of an action by considering whether the maxim, the subjective principle of our action, could be universalized without contradiction. Another important formulation is the formula of humanity as an end in itself. Act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never merely as a means to an end, but always at the same time as an end. This formulation emphasizes respect for the intrinsic dignity of every human being, who should be treated as a means to an end in themselves, and not merely as an instrument to achieve our own ends. A third formulation is the formula of the kingdom of ends, which exhorts us to act as if we were, through our maxims, legislative members in a universal kingdom of ends. These formulation of the categorical imperative have profound implications for respect for human dignity, for the defense of human and for the pursuit of justice. Kantian ethics has had a significant lasting influence on Western moral and political thought. It provided the basis for various deontological theories in ethics which emphasize duty and moral obligation as the foundations of ethical action. The categorical imperative and the emphasis on respect for human dignity have had a crucial impact on the conception of human RGHTS and justice. In political philosophy, Kantian ethics influenced the development of the concept of Rechtsstaat, rule law, a constitutional state that limits the power of the government to protect the civil liberties of citizens. Even in contemporary debates in applied ethics, Kantian principles continue to be an important point of reference. Kant's influence on the philosophy of science. In Immanuel Kant's philosophy, science is conceived as a type of knowledge that combines the necessity and universality of the a priori principles of the understanding with the empirical information provided by sensory experience. For Kant, science is not a mere collection of contingent observations, but rather organized system of laws of nature that are necessary and objective. He argues that the a priori principles of the understanding, the categories, play a fundamental role in the foundation of scientific knowledge, as they are what structure OUE experience of nature and make the formulation of universal laws possible. Kant distinguishes between empirical laws of nature, which are discovered through experience, and a priori laws of nature, which are conditions of possibility of any experience and therefore possess a transcendental necessity. Mathematics, for Kant, is essential for SEIS, as it provides the instruments for the precise construction of the concepts that describe natural phenomena. In his work, Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science, Kant seeks to provide a philosophical a priori basis for Newtonian physics, which he considered the model of science proper. He establishes the metaphysical principles that underlie the different areas of physics, such as pheronomy, the theory of motion dynamics, the theory of forces mechanics, the theory of the motion of bodies under the action of forces, and phenomenology, the description of phenomena. Although the success and relevance of the metaphysical foundations have been the subject of debate, this work represents a significant attempt to articulate the relationship between transcendental philosophy and empirical science. For Kant, scientific laws are not mere indicative generalizations from experience, but necessary principles that govern nature. These laws result spontaneous legislative act of the understanding, which imposes order and structure on the phenomenal world. Kant establishes a hierarchy between different types of laws. Transcendental laws, which are the most general and apply to all objects of experience. Mechanical laws, which are deduced from transcendental laws apply to the empirical concept of matter. And particular empirical laws, which are more specific and depend on a substantial empirical component. It is important to note the distinction between the necessity of the laws of nature, which is an objective determination of phenomena, and the necessity of the moral law, which is an obligation emunced by practical reason. Kant's philosophy of science has had a lasting influence on the epistemology of science and continues to be relevant to contemporary debates. His ideas about the cognitive structure of the mind and the role of categories in scientific knowledge inform discussions about scientific realism, anti-realism, and the nature of scientific explanation. There is also an ongoing debate about whether Kantian epistemology is contradictory or compatible with later scientific developments, such as quantum physics, which challenges some of our classical intuitions about causality and the nature of reality. Furthermore, Kant's emphasis on the active role of the mind in organizing experience has influenced the development of scientific methodology in various areas. The video is already long. I know you are busy. It's the first part. If you got here, I leave my thanks and follow the channel for the second part. It really is an impression story, I's great story of ours. Kant's thought had a profound impact on his successors' Western thought. He was a fundamental influence on German idealism, with philosophers such as Joseph Schelling and Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, developing their own philosophies in response to Kant thought. Kant also influenced the emergence of neo-Kantianism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a movement that sought to revive and refine Kantian philosophy, with various schools emphasizing different aspects of his thought. Kant's influence can be traced indirectly in movements such as Marxism through Hegel phenomenology, through neo-Kantianism and existentialism, through his ethics, demonstrating his lasting importance in the history of philosophy.